Maybe you've tried to study anatomy, done gesture drawing, drawn cubes in different perspectives, but you still feel like you're stuck in the same place. And it's not because you're lacking talent, it's because you're relying on a system that is broken for learning art. The system that you use will dictate how fast you learn an art skill. That can be anatomy or gesture or learning to draw fantasy creatures. And if you're using the advice of just draw more to get better, then you're leaving the process of actually learning art up to chance. And that's why so often it feels like to learn art, it takes years and years, or you have to be extremely talented to be able to get good at this skill. It might feel impossible to draw from your imagination because you're not training your brain to retrieve the information that you're gathering from those study sessions. Let's say you're learning how to draw the face, or you're trying to learn how to draw the body. Unless you're applying certain retrieval practices inside of your study sessions, that information is going to go in one ear and out the other. Our brains are constantly receiving a vast amount of information, from the temperature of the air to the color of our socks, and it has to filter through what's actually important, what it's going to store into the long-term memory, and what it's just going to pass by and turn into garbage. And so it needs a tangible reason why it should be holding on to this information. And if you ever went to school, you probably realized that just because you said, well, I want to study this, or I want to get good at this, I want to learn biology so I can pass my test, it doesn't mean that the brain is going to automatically start to hold on to that information. And if you were to just open the book and say, okay, well, I'm just going to read more about biology, that also doesn't mean that you're going to magically ace your test either. It matters about how you're studying the biology. It matters how we study art. And that will make the difference between taking years and years to learn a certain fundamental in art and just taking 2 or 3 months and then getting to the next place. I used to avoid drawing from imagination. I got good at the skill of copying other artists' art, and it looked nice. I was proud of how that looked, but anytime I tried to draw something from my own mind, I always fell so short, and it demotivated me because on one hand, I drew really nice when I was copying other people, but whenever I wanted to do something from my own self, my own creative endeavor, there were so many mistakes that I was facing. And so I would go back and watch another tutorial and try to figure out how to draw the face, how to draw the body so the proportions and everything looks nice and aesthetic. But nothing was sticking, and I was stuck in that beginner hell phase. It was a constant loop of studying and then trying to apply it and then being disappointed because it's not working. But then I started to study, how does the brain actually go about learning? And it's not about absorbing more information or putting more time into a skill. It's about applying the right system for learning. And then learning actually becomes easy. The information goes into the long-term memory. It becomes motivating because on a day-to-day basis, you're seeing improvements in your craft. And that is one of the key elements towards motivation, is seeing progress. If we spend hours and weeks and months towards learning something like art and we're not seeing any progress, naturally the brain's going to say, well, maybe this isn't for us. There's something that's wrong here because we're not seeing the improvement that we should be seeing with all the energy and effort that we're putting into it. Let's go over a couple of art practices that practically apply this so that we can achieve our art goals quickly. The first exercise is study small, quick, and then test yourself. Our brains love the idea of repetition. That's why once you've built a habit, it's very easy to stick to it. But because our brains like that repetition, it's easy to fall into mindlessly practicing. So by doing studies that last 2 to 3 minutes, like a gesture study, and then comparing it with a reference and noticing the differences between ours and the master's, or ours and the reference, and making physical notes like you would in school, or like you would when you're trying to study any topic, not only are you feeding into that repetition that the brain loves, but you're keeping it out of the mindless practicing. And you're feeding it information about how to actually go improve. So let's say you're doing a gesture drawing, and this practice is all about focusing on making the lines flow and get the right proportions so that the length of the body is at the right proportions to the length of the arms. If you do a 2-minute gesture, you can immediately compare it with the study and see how well your brain is reading between the reference and your study. And you can make a note, okay, now over the past 5 little gesture drawings that I did that lasted 2 minutes, all of them were a bit too short compared to the arms. So the next 5 that you can do, you can immediately push that a little bit. Just actively make the body a bit longer. And now you've immediately had an improvement towards your art that you can apply when you do something like a long 4-hour-long piece when you're drawing the whole body. Because we're doing a quick study like this, you're forced to look at your mistakes right away and figure out how to go about fixing them. And that area where you're looking at your mistakes strains the brain. And that strain is the exact thing that builds those connections so that our brain actually learns. For example, it's the same thing if we went to the gym. If you go to the gym for 1,000 days, you don't ever strain your muscles. nothing will actually happen. We have to put ourselves under that resistance, under the load of the weight, to actually grow the muscle. And the brain works very similar to that. If we just draw more without looking at our mistakes, without straining our brain a little bit and trying to fix those mistakes, nothing's gonna happen to our drawing ability. It'll stay in the same place. But when we actively look for our mistakes and actively go in and hone in on them and fix them, that is when our brain starts to form those strong connections, and the brain takes that information and puts it into the long-term memory. Exercise number 2 is blind studies. This is where you look at a picture, you look at a reference or a master's drawing, and you study it. You stare at it for 2 minutes. You allow your brain to turn the picture into basic shapes in your mind, turning the body into cylinders, spheres, and rectangles, squares, and just staring at it. And for 2 minutes, it's a really long time to just stare at that picture. But after those 2 minutes, you move the reference out of the way so you can't see it anymore. And then to the best of your ability, draw what you remember. Now, again, the brain's gonna have to go through that straining process. And inevitably, there's gonna be those mistakes, but those are the mistakes, those are the holes, the gaps in your knowledge that we wanna hone in on and focus on improving the next time we do the drawing. So you can set 2 minutes to look at the picture and 10 minutes to do a quick drawing of that picture from your memory. And when you're done the drawing, you can compare it back with the reference and see where the gaps in your knowledge are. And you note those, you physically note those out beside the drawing with little lines and make it look almost like a little science project, telling yourself what you missed in your drawing. This way, when you do the drawing again, you have those mental notes about what you should be focusing on again. Maybe you made the ribcage too long, too wide, or the head is a bit too big compared to the body. You can focus on that for the next drawing. The last exercise is where you create mini challenges for yourself. Let's say you enjoy drawing knights in shining armor. You would take a reference of a knight in a shining armor and you would, to the best of your ability, copy that reference. And then you would erase something like one of the arms or one of the legs, and you would now allow your brain to assume and place that arm in a different position and alter the design of the armor for that arm or that leg. And because, again, the brain is straining and it's having to work and figure out, how does the armor look when the arm is in this position? When your brain is having to solve that problem, that builds and fills in those gaps of knowledge, because you can look back at the reference later and see, okay, I don't think the shoulder pad would look like that when it's in a different position. You can go back and adjust it. And again, it's that straining of the brain that will allow your brain to fill in those gaps of knowledge. It's all about putting our brain in a little bit of an uncomfortable position, straining it a little bit, and then coming out on the other side and saying, what did I do wrong? What do I need to do better next time? And then honing on exactly what we need to work on that allows our brain to make that progress. The only gap between where you are and where you want to get with your art goals is stepping into that uncomfortable resistance, just allowing your brain to strain a little bit, to problem solve a little bit. The first link in the description is a free ebook where I break this down in a lot more detail, where I give much more practical examples about how to practice art in a way where the information that you're learning actually gets stored in your long-term memory. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next one.